The world is waking up, and you finding your way here today is no coincidence. The spirit world always has a way of guiding us where we most need to be at the absolute perfect time. I'm your host, Lindsay Morlock, and you're listening to the Guided Podcast, where we explore how the spirit world works on our behalf to guide us along our paths. This is where you'll learn how to live a life that is both conscious and connected, so you can supercharge your pathway to healing and open to life's magic and miracles. Come along this journey to see how guided you truly are. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Guided. We are going to be diving into the episode shortly, but I wanted to preface this conversation by apologizing in advance for some audio issues we had with our guest's microphone. As you'll notice, some of her words trail off or get cut off, but that said, we decided that the content within was simply too good not to share, and we didn't want to compromise the authenticity of the conversation by trying to recreate it. So please keep that in mind as you listen, and I really hope you enjoy the show and feel as inspired by Miriam's story as I do. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to this week's guest, Miriam Jacobson, a triple board certified functional medicine dietitian and breathwork facilitator with 15 plus years of experience helping people improve their physical and mental well-being through food, mindset, lifestyle, breathwork, and somatic treatment so that they can feel more alive in their bodies. Her healing practice is greatly influenced by her personal journey of losing her father to 9/11 when she was 13 and being poisoned by pollutants from the Twin Towers falling and surviving breast cancer at the age of 31. She is the founder of Every Body Bliss, and Miriam's holistic healing approach challenges current medical narratives by examining physiological, biochemical, social, and emotional factors to resolve underlying mystery symptoms of poor digestion, fatigue, and mood imbalances. So Miriam, welcome to the show. I am so excited to talk with you today. Miriam and I actually met several years ago at our breathwork training, and I want to say we were standing in line for the bathroom, and it was a long line, and we just kept looking at each other, but not really saying anything. And so we finally had this moment of looking at each other and feeling like we knew each other, but we obviously had never met before. And then during the weekend, we ended up being paired together for an exercise, and it just felt completely synchronistic. And I always felt this soul connection with you. And so I'm super excited for the audience to hear your story and learn more about the medicine that you offer the world.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for having me here. I'm really excited to have this really important conversation. And it's been such a gift to be able to meet you and then see how our paths connected throughout the last few years.
Yeah, so let's just dive right in. And I would love for us to just start with the question that I ask everybody coming on the show, which is, would you be willing to share your awakening story? Just offer the audience in whatever way you're comfortable, how your own personal journey with spirit, the universe, and spiritual seeking unfolded.
Yeah, wow, what a big question. I think to preface it, my spiritual awakening or awakening process has unfolded throughout the last 20 plus years. And it had continued to unfold, to be honest. Every time I face a challenge, I am able to pull back a layer and just examine what's important for me, what I believe, and it's a constant reassessment. And so, like you mentioned in my bio, my father was killed on 9/11. I was 13 years old at the time. And about 3 weeks after 9/11, my mom was actually diagnosed with breast cancer. And that was her first cancer. And at the time, I was 13 years old, and just my inner world had fell apart, and then my entire city had fallen apart, living in New York City on the Lower East Side. And so the world was really unsafe at that time. And the result of that was I went inward and I numbed, and I was terrified of feeling my emotions. I told myself a story that if I connected with myself, if I connected with the grief, then I would fall into a black hole that I would never come out. And so I buried that pain for years. And then I ended up in school and college at the University of Wisconsin. All of it came to a head where I had finally left my city. I was an adult, more or less. And I was having conversations with people, and I was constantly getting triggered because people were like, "Oh, where were you on 9/11? Do you know anyone who died?" And those were curious questions that were really, invasive, obviously, but people really didn't understand that there were actually people who are firsthand impacted by it. And that was the first time where I was like, wow, I'm in pain and I don't know what to do with pain. So I think that was the first step of like this awakening process where I was like, I need to really look at what's going on in my mind and in my heart and examine this because I feel so broken. And that was probably the catalyst to my healing, right? To my spiritual, mental, emotional healing that then jump started an entire career of me being a functional medicine dietitian. And then as I've gone through more challenges, like my mom passed away when I was 25 years old and I was diagnosed with cancer, at each one of those challenges, felt like my life had fallen apart. And like, okay, where are the pieces that I want to put back together? And to me, that is the spiritual journey because it's really looking at who I am. Who am I without my family? Why am I without my body? And what do I want to bring into the world through that?
Thank you for sharing, first of
Yeah.
all. And I think one of the things that strikes me so much about your story is the level of grief that you've dealt with, because you've dealt with grief on a personal level when we think of the loss of human life. But when we also have things happen like medical diagnoses like cancer, there is a loss and perceived losses that are involved. So there's a whole other grieving process, like the loss of perceived vibrant health, even if it's only temporary. There's so many different levels and layers of loss that it seems like you've dealt with. And so where do you even start with navigating that level of loss? I mean, I feel like one loss is hard enough, no
Yeah.
less this compounding effect of all of these subsequent losses.
Well, I think when I first started, right after my dad died, 5 years after my dad died, it was because I didn't have a choice. I felt like I would die or I could walk through fire and figure out what was on the other side. For me and my journey, knowing that I'd done that, and that was the hardest thing I'd probably ever done in my life, knowing that I'd done that and I was able to transform through that grief had given me a lot of resilience when I faced something new. And I'm like, okay, I've done it before. I know that I'm going to like being okay is relative, right? Like sometimes it's okay to not be okay, but I know that I haven't been okay, but I've also been okay through through going through and diving into the belly of the beast almost. Cause I know that there's always another side. There's always a way life evolves. And so that's the way that I approach life now is I know grief is inevitable. And so I'm like, how do I just create choices based on my intuition? And now there are moments that I've actually chosen grief in my life. Like I am almost at the other end of a divorce right now. And that was a really hard decision to make because I'm like, I'm choosing this grief right now because it just doesn't feel aligned in my life.
Yeah.
And I know it's not something that's providing me what I deserve. So anyway, doing it over and over again, honestly, is what it equipped me to do it more and more. And I really do think it's a muscle.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And it sounds like you've really anchored in this. I almost want to say like you're fortifying your ability to navigate the challenge. It's like you've anchored in within yourself. I know this hurts. I know there's pain. And I also know that I'm going to make it through to the other side, which is sometimes really hard to see when we're going through it. And I always feel like the benefit of hindsight, right, is 2020. But when you're going through it, is that something that you feel like you have to constantly bring yourself back to? Like honor the pain that you're feeling and then bring yourself back to the remembering of, I know there will be another side of this? Or like in the moment, how do you help yourself and encourage
Yeah.
yourself through that?
That is a big part of it. Knowing that, yeah, it feels like it's falling apart, but this is temporary. It isn't forever, and I have to remind myself of it because sometimes I think it's a universal truth. Like we can all get lost, and it's not always the time to address it. I really do believe that. But like when I'm in and I'm like, listen, this is what I've done before, and I remember this is how I was before, and this is how I was after. And it's not like a clear cut before and after always, but reminding myself of like my personal evolution. And then another thing that's really helped me is anchoring myself in this like mantra of I didn't survive everything I survived to settle for a life I don't want. That's what helps me choose.
Wait, can you say that one more time? Because
Yeah.
it's so good.
Yeah. So I didn't survive everything that I survived in my life to settle for a life I don't want. And that honestly helps me choose the grief when I'm like resistant to it, even though I intuitively know it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Wait, say more about that. Like, how do you just intuitively choose the grief? Is this like about being with it?
Well, yeah, I think it's about being open to just letting myself cry and move through the emotions of it, or letting myself make the really hard decision to allow certain things in my life to come to an end.
Yeah.
You know,
It's beautiful because I do think anytime I get messages from spirit about grief, I feel like the message that they consistently give is that navigating loss is one of the harder or hardest human lessons that we have to move through, whatever kind of loss we're moving through, right? And there's many different levels and layers. And of course, some of us, I feel like, have an easier time dealing with certain types of loss versus other types of loss, right? We might be navigating human loss differently than we navigate a transition for a career, but it's still a loss. And grief needs to be felt, it needs to be released. If we block the grief, we're going to be finding ourselves in some other emotion, or it's going to be releasing in some other unhealthy way down the road. And so I think it's such a good reminder to people, like, emotions are meant to be felt and released. We're not meant to be marinating in our thoughts about them, right? We need to feel them and release them in the body.
absolutely. And that resonates so deeply because I haven't really talked about this right now. But like after my dad died, I held in I literally just shoved my emotions down. I held it all in. And it manifested physically as well as with like mental stuff and PTSD. But I was really sick. Like I was sleeping 14 hours a day. I was constantly anxious. 13 years old, I had such bad migraines, I couldn't go to school some days. Then I started developing digestive issues, and my doctor had no idea what was happening because it was very deeply rooted in emotional stuff, right? Like I was emotionally eating, I was, avoiding things, and it settled in my nervous system.
Yeah. So is that what was partly the catalyst for what got you interested in the nutrition aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I'd always wanted to help people. So, like even before my father passed away, I knew I was a helper. I wanted to be in the helping profession.
Yeah.
And when I was in school, I stumbled across a nutrition class and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I need to fulfill my science requirements. And then that led me on a path where I was really curious about nutrition. And then once I was graduated actually with my degree is when I really found functional medicine and was able to figure out how to use nutrition to heal my body. And that was the first time that I was going to the doctor and at the same time working for a functional medicine dietitian or nutritionist. And my doctor was like, "It's 'cause you're a woman." Like, I don't know why you have these problems. And I'm like, big eye roll, so long. And then my boss helped me with nutrition. And so that's how I understood like the deep impact that food and nutrition can have on our bodies. But I think it's an interwoven piece because later on I understood more deeply the impact of spirituality and our mental emotional health on the health of our bodies as well. And that the relationship is bidirectional. Like what we eat, how we fuel ourselves impact our gut health, but also our organs don't exist in a vacuum. We're human beings in the world.
Yeah. I know. I've had a similar experience in terms of I've had different levels of I've worked with functional nutritionists in the past, which is why I'm such a big believer in them. I truly feel like that's what helped me get my body back into balance when blood work was like, "No, you're fine." I'm like, "I know I'm not fine. I don't feel
Yeah.
fine. My body feels incredibly out of whack." I was reacting to all sorts of different foods, but it was interesting because to your point about the bidirectionality, I felt like I needed a parallel approach to healing. I needed to be able to deal with the mental and the spiritual and the emotional at the same time that I was addressing the physical needs. And it was this like trifecta of bringing the body back into balance with all of these things. And so it sounds like you are similar in that frame of mind.
Yeah, and in frame of practice of why, I'm like, okay, I'm a functional medicine dietitian, but I need other tools to help people move these emotions. That's where the breathwork comes in, and like where the somatic practices come in. Because you're right, it needs to be everything needs to be considered. Because when we're really looking at root causes and why people are sick, we can't ignore the emotion.
Yeah. Can I ask you, and getting a little personal here
Yeah.
with a cancer diagnosis, how do you approach a cancer diagnosis from this multifaceted understanding of like, okay, so I have this physical challenge that I now need to address. but also what is the underlying significance of all of this and navigating that? I mean, it feels really big.
I mean, it is really big. And I don't think that there's always a time for healing. I think that there is a time for grief and being mad and just like so I was diagnosed at 31. I found my own cancer. Like I found my own cancer and really, really pushed for the diagnosis because they kept being like, you don't have cancer. It doesn't feel like cancer. You're 31 years old. And I was like, no, there's something wrong with my body. I know my body so well. There's something wrong here and you need to like take me seriously. And so just even trusting myself inside that diagnosis was really important. And then after I was diagnosed and I actually ended up needing a double mastectomy and I did reconstruction, I felt like such a victim. And I needed to feel like a victim. I needed to be in a self-pity place for a little while. My cancer diagnosis was directly related to toxic exposure from 9/11. And so after my diagnosis, I was like, oh my gosh, like, why can't I fake 9/11? Like, why is this a poison that has figuratively and literally seeped into every aspect
Wow.
of my life? And I'm like, why me? But then there, like, why me? And I was really angry and I was really upset. And about 5 days before, I didn't tell you this, but about 5 days before my mastectomy, I was attacked on the street. And it was just like, boom, boom, like, why am I a victim? Like in there. And I really, after my surgery, I couldn't move. And so I was like plastered to the couch and just needed to cry. I needed to feel like this deep, deep pain. And it wasn't time to be like, there's another time. Like I was just in it, And as I was able to take some of the physical pain and like as my body healed a little bit and I started getting back into my body, it's 5 months to like get to this place. But intermittently, I would get these downloads of like, you need to share your story. You have this bigger story to share. And like, you can really help people and you can help yourself. Like, this can be healing, And so that's when I started to write again and find a writing teacher. And I started writing my memoir, which I'm still working on. But I think for me, allowing myself to like really be in it and then also realizing that there could be a bigger purpose and this could be part of my life's purpose if I'm able to really transmute it, right? And that's really how I can bring health and healing to other people. And so for me, it's become a catalyst and also a course corrector of when was I not listening to myself? Because before I got cancer, I'm a really good person now. I feel much more grounded in myself, connected to my intuition, but because I needed to allow myself to fall apart. And then we fall apart, it's like almost like from like the pieces are, everything's on the table. And it's like, okay, which piece do I want to pick up to rebuild? And what do I want to leave behind?
Yeah. So can you go more into that? Like, I'm really curious about that process. It's like, so everything, right? You have this life-changing event happen. And how does it, because you hear people talk about this a lot, right? There's something massive in their life, whether it's a health scare, whether it's, whatever, someone dies, and it's all of a sudden you're looking at the world through a totally different lens, right? And
Yeah.
so what was it about the cancer diagnosis, or maybe not even about the cancer diagnosis, but like, what were the pieces that you were like, not willing to live with this, not willing to live with this? Like, to your point about like, I'm not settling for anything less than I deserve. Like, how do you get there from this puddle of grief, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a highly anxious person. I think the combination of like being Jewish and growing up in New York, Houston, right? I'm a very anxious person. And I woke up every day since my mom died until like my cancer, every single day being like, why am I here? Why am I here? I don't want to live my life. I am not excited about my work. Like I own a business. I'm like, why the hell do I own a business if I don't enjoy it or like it? right? And so I go back to my morning pages every single day. I was like, anxious, anxious, anxious. Why am I here? Right. And just dreading my day and dreading my life and like not seeing an end to or a joy at the end. Right. And so when I was diagnosed with cancer, I was like, holy crap, I'm not living. I'm a shell of what I want my life. I want a big life. I want to help people. I want to enjoy myself. Like I want to feel like I'm grounded in my purpose. And I didn't have any of that. Right. But I'm like, but I love what I do. And so what is it about,
Yeah.
And I think I realized that I was like hiding a big part of myself. And I don't know, my story, right? Which is what we're talking about. But really thinking about like, what do I want to do to live a more engaged life? And then slowly just asking myself that question kind of was like a taxi light that brought my attention to when my intuition was like pinging, like buzzing, like, yeah. Like I am very connected with my body, so my body speaks, right?
Right.
And I think all of our bodies, some of us are more connected than others. And when I feel something exciting, right? Like I feel a higher vibration, like I feel the energy inside of myself. And when something doesn't feel right, it feels compressing.
Interesting.
And so I started getting intuitive hits. I want to write my book. Okay. And then I'll go find a writing teacher, right? And I'm like, this feels really good, right? This is the right path, right? Like I finally found the right business coach for myself. And I'm like, I feel that it's right. Like I know I'm wrong because I end up getting off a call and I cry, right? Or I feel really crappy. So like I just started listening to what my body was telling me and then tried to honor that as much as possible. And that's how I feel like a big piece of it began to course correct.
Yeah, I think that's a really important message for people because our intuition is of the body. I think sometimes people assume that our intuition, if someone's clairaudient, right? And they're like, oh, they're assuming they're hearing things all the time or like seeing things all the time. And it's like for most of us, I mean, it's not that those clairs don't exist, they absolutely do. And our knowing and our trust is in our bodies. So, right, like knowing what a yes feels like for people and knowing what your no feels like is super important to reconnect with. But when we are really anxious, like our mind sometimes, if we have lightning fast minds, I'm very similar. Like that mind just overrides anything that you're feeling in the body unless you're consciously bringing your attention back to like, wait a minute, how am I feeling right now? So I think
Yeah.
it's such an important message.
Yeah. Yeah. And so many of us are taught to disconnect from our body. It's not a safe place to be for whatever reason that is. Like whether that's assault, whether that's living as a woman in our world who's taught that we should feel shame for our bodies and what they look like, right? So,
Right.
and it's uncomfortable to feel grief. It's uncomfortable to feel emotions a lot of the time. So many of us want to leave, but like opting out and leaving is what I think would disconnect us. So,
100%. Yep. Or we think about our emotions, right? And people think that's processing when we're thinking about how we feel, but it's just the way we're bypassing how we feel, right? Because feeling is in the body. And I feel like, one of the things that you mentioned, right, to like the diagnosis, it was like a catalyst for you to realize like you want to be fully engaged with your life. And that really struck me because under different circumstances, I had that same moment of like just being so overwhelmed with all the changes I had made in my life. Like I moved across the country, I moved away from family and friends, I quit my corporate job and started a business. And I did all of these things at once, essentially. And it was so overwhelming that was my like disengage from life in a way because it was just it was too much, right? Too much happening at once. So no matter what it is for people, I think a lot of us have those moments where we're like totally disengaged with our life and it doesn't feel good anymore. And then there's something that happens that wakes us up again to like, wait a minute, how do I want to show up in my own life? And like, what am I willing to settle for and what am I not?
yeah. And I think sometimes like healing is a privilege in today's world. The space and a capacity that it takes to heal and feel those emotions can compromise other parts of, the way that you show up. And so I do believe that there's not always the time and like it's not always the right time to
Yeah.
go in. I think that our bodies are not really wise and there's a reason there's like dissociation, and I think sometimes that does keep us safe. And there will always be a time eventually, right, where it is time to dive in to awaken, right? But I think that timeline is really different for everyone. And I find that a lot of people feel like a lot of pressure. They're like, oh my gosh, I have to feel it right away. But it's okay. As long as you're aware and you're grounded, like that is a thing in your life, it will unfold as it needs to unfold too. And as long as you're showing up and staying connected.
I agree with you. I do feel, and I think that, so many people that I've talked to moving through processes of grief have like talked about how it was like they were always kind of moving into these different levels and layers of grief as they felt ready to handle it, because it can be very traumatizing to the system to move through these different levels and layers of emotions, and something as big as grief, right? Like this isn't a one and done of processing your emotions. It's a process. And so one of the things that you shared with me that I would love to get into is around the idea of, are we victims of our circumstances? And how do we feel moving through these things? But you moved from a place of like really feeling like you said it, like, why is this happening, to finding your empowerment through it. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about like navigating that journey from maybe feeling a little bit powerless to finding your power there.
Yeah. I mean, so funny because we were talking before this, and I'll just share because it's relevant. But when we first met, when we were first partnered, I think we knew each other's name probably, but that was about it.
Yeah.
And our teacher was like, okay, it's time to like deliver intuitive messages to your partner. Like, we don't know anything about each other's lives. And the message that you delivered to me was, you're not a victim. Life is happening for you, not to you. And this was like a day or two before my biopsy. I went to the breathwork training and then I had a biopsy scheduled. So I sat with that because I was like, the message my entire life is that I'm a victim, right? Like, we've been victimized as 9/11 survivors. We're victimized, right? Like,
Right.
the language surrounding everything for 9/11 families is all about victim compensation fund, right? Like, there are so many ways that language has made its way through my life. I'm also the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, right? So my family, they were quite literally victims in many ways. And I think after I got that message from you, I was sitting on it for weeks and I was like, am I a victim or is life happening for me? And then something began to snap into place where I was like, it doesn't need to be one or the other. Like, I can be victimized, right? Like, there are things that happen in life, but we're not always responsible for the thing. Like, a lot of the time,
Our wounding is not our fault. Absolutely
not
not.
at all. It's like crap from our families and society and institutions and like systemic issues, as well as like the world is a really hard place to live in, And I think that's the part that I struggle a lot with the spiritual community, is that bypassing. No, we're responsible for everything in our lives. It can be dangerous.
Yeah.
Dangerous, And so
I feel like our wounding is never our fault, but it is our responsibility to heal. And I think, to your point, that's where the responsibility comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm like, I can be a victim, but I can also use my pain as a source of power. I can alchemize this. I can transmute this too. So like, I still very much identify as a victim, but I also know because of my history, because of my past, because of everything that's happened to me and to my family.
Like in an ancestral trauma kind of way.
Ancestral trauma, direct. But I can still evolve through it, right? And that's really empowering. So I hold both.
It's really interesting because I don't think when I gave you that message, right, I didn't know any of this that you were going through at the time. And in hindsight, I can see how that message would be super triggering to anybody, right? Like going through what you were going through. And I think it's such an appropriate example, honestly, of how spirit works through us, right? Because spirit doesn't always tell us what we want to hear. They tell us something that we need to hear, right? That's going to catalyze something within us to spark some level of deeper awakening or understanding, or, right, like move us in a certain direction. And so it sort of sounds like that's what, right? Like, I'm sure it was very angering in a way, right? To like hear that, be like, I'm to go into a biopsy and you're telling me, right?
Yeah, I was like, yeah, but then I was like, there's a reason the message won't leave me, and I need to figure out how to make meaning of it, right? and use it as a way to empower me as well. And that's what I end up doing with it. And it's a message I think about like every day.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, it's something that I feel like, listen, I'm very similar in the sense that even if I don't walk around like using the word that I feel victimized by circumstances in my life, I very much act that way, that I feel like a victim of certain circumstances, or I feel like a victim of, if something happens. I mean, it can be as simple, right? We all do this. Like have a negative interaction with someone and we feel victimized. Or, I was in a hit and run car accident at one point and this truck driver just walked right. I felt like a victim, right? Like of that. So I think everybody can identify on some level to feeling victimized by our circumstances. And to your point, like, how do we allow these experiences to empower us? I think it's just about allowing ourselves to get curious about, like, what is it that is causing us to take it, so whatever it is, so personally, right? Like, because something's being triggered within us. It's triggering some sort of wound in order for us to heal it. And I think that's ultimately what the point of Spirit's message is. It's like, how, it's happening for us because it's showing us where there's a wound that we need to bring more love to. And how do we bring, right? It's not to negate or to minimize or diminish the impact of whatever experiences we've had, but also how do we then help ourselves bring love and compassion and healing to those wounded parts of ourselves so that we can feel more at peace around these things as we move through our lives. So we're not like walking around projecting all of our hurt on the rest of the world, right?
Yeah. And I think absolutely. And they don't need to, it doesn't need to be mutually exclusive. Like there can be both, and I think so many, like in our world, we're so used to living in like a binary place. It's like, how do we break down those barriers and realize that all of it?
That's such a good point. I literally just recorded a podcast that I was talking about the both and. Like,
Yeah.
very, very seldom is it this or that. It's this and that. And I think all of the lessons we move through in life, right? Like it speaks to that. Like it's all the things.
And there's so much nuance. And I think as humans, we want definitions. We want to stay in a lane. We want to understand and make sense of it. And sometimes there's really not one answer.
Yeah.
It really is both and.
Yeah. And so, like, as we transition into embracing all of the things, right, as part of our healing and looking at all of the different facets, like, what are the different ways that you leaned on your own spiritual practices or your own spiritual support team, like, through all the different, trials and tribulations that you have experienced? And even the good stuff, because it's not just, I mean, sometimes we just talk about leaning on Spirit when we're moving through the negative, but it's not, right? We're always we can always stay connected and have access to that place of us.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think over the years, because I've been like on my journey, and I put that in quotes, like on my journey for the last 20 plus years, I've been able to gather tools that work for me. And it's almost like having like a little toolkit where I'm not going to use a hammer for everything. Sometimes you need a screwdriver, right? So I call on different tools, right? I think therapy was my foundation, right? And it's such an important tool to have in my back pocket. But as time has evolved and progressed, I found breathwork, which I love, and yoga, which I love, because they're embodied practices and you don't need anything. You don't need anyone else. You just need yourself, your body, and your breath. Yeah. And so I love those kinds of practices. And after my cancer diagnosis, again, because I did breathwork training right before, I was like, I'm going to do breathwork every day. And then it started to get in handy when I got my diagnosis, and I was like, I'm just going to do it every single day before my surgery. And I think it ended up being like 40 days. It was something like really weird and strange, like serendipitous number like that. But just having 15 minutes a day where I could just like lay in my bed and like bawl my eyes out and breathe and just like move the grief through my body was such an important container for me, because it allowed me to approach life, in a way where I was like, oh, I need to show up to these 10 doctor's appointments that I have to see. And so it actually allowed me to stay grounded and present and make decisions for myself that I needed to make and show up in the way that I needed to really show up before I went through such a massive surgery. But I do agree, like working through the grief expands our capacity for joy and allows us to be more present in our bodies and our lives. So as an example, I totally burnt out in 2020, 2021. I had just finished my cancer surgery when my ex-husband now, he was diagnosed with cancer. So I became a patient and a caretaker. I was running a business, writing a book, and I burnt out. And my therapist at the time, she was like, Miriam, you have said about 5 times that you want to just write and travel. Like, what's this about? And is there any way we can make And so I was like, okay, message received. And I started listening to myself. And every time I thought about traveling, my body lit up and I was all I want. Like I would cry. I'm like, that's all I want. And I crunched the number and then I really sat down and I was like, I can make this happen. I can do this. So in 2022, shut down my business, took off, traveled to 13 countries. I had, my blessings. And it was the best year of my life. And I really felt so joyful and so present as I moved to that. And I realized like what a unique opportunity that was. But it was because of this practice of leaning into my body and like listening to what I really needed, what I really want, what led me to that place too. So I agree with you. I think that it is important for healing, but healing doesn't always need to be like crying in bed. Like healing can
Totally.
be joyful and being like back in the world and creating relationships with people all over and, like just expanding our vibration too.
I think that is such important advice because I think so many people have the either like breakdown to break open story, right? But healing doesn't have to be painful. It's our resistance to healing that is usually what creates suffering. But you're right, like it can be really joyful. Can you talk about that? Just sounds like such an amazing experience to be able to just I'm fascinated by like, did you have fear about you're single at this point, right? You're shutting down your business.
I'm still with my ex at this point.
So there was a whole other set of factors there then, right?
Oh yeah.
So I would love to just hear more about the experience and like what you took away and like learned as this whole 13-month journey unfolded.
Yeah, well, I mean, to start, like I was telling myself these stories about how I would never be able to travel again because I was plastered to my couch for 6 months. I had lost most of my body's muscle and really like I'm a strong person. I lost most of my body's muscle. I felt so weak. And I thought about traveling and I just like wanted to travel so badly. And I just couldn't imagine even picking up a carry-on to an overhead compartment. Like that wasn't even, I couldn't breathe my arms. I couldn't have a bucket of water. Like even doing that felt so beyond. And so my first trip out of my sabbatical was deciding to go surfing in Costa Rica. And it was just such celebration of my body. Like it was such a celebratory way of using my body. But yeah, I was navigating, leaving my husband, leaving my beautiful home. I just got a dog at that point, and I was like, I have so many responsibilities. There's so many reasons I shouldn't be doing this, right? But I was like, but this is what I want. And so as I, moved through the year, I kind of just went where my heart told me to go and where I was led to. But I had so much fear, and I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. But there's like, I think that there's some sort of like David Bowie quote and talks about how if you don't feel like your legs are dangling off a cliff, like you're not living.
So you were embracing.
Yeah. And I was like, let's do this. And I actually ended my year in New Zealand and Fiji. And I actually went bungee jumping, like metaphoric, like
jumping off a cliff.
And I like literally jump off the bridge, actually.
Wow. What an experience. Yeah, that's so awesome. I feel like, that's often our intuition. Like our intuition is generally not logical. Like it usually makes no sense what we're being called and led to do. And yet it always feels good when we end up following it. Not that there's not, and I think that's kind of a misconception. Like it's not that there's not fear that comes up when we're following our intuition. It's about holding ourselves through whatever discomfort comes up and doing it anyway and continuing to take the steps we need to take.
Well, and that discomfort is growth. It's us reaching the edges of our container and being like, oh, like this is uncomfortable. Like a lizard shedding its skin. It's like we have to shed parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
We grow, but we have to learn to hold discomfort. I think that's one of the most important skills.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, like, are not I don't know that you ever the whole, like, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, I don't know that you ever get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Maybe we move into acceptance around the fact that we're gonna be uncomfortable, and that's maybe where the comfort comes from, but I agree with you. I mean, I just think it's holding ourselves through all of the emotions that come up with the discomfort as we continue to, like, move forward, and it's were there times that you felt wary? I feel like I've been contemplating a lot, like, that soul wariness where I think so many people can identify, like, when you're moving through different levels and layers of hard experiences where there's a point where you're like, "I know I'm on the right path. I know I need to keep going," and emotionally, I'm like, "I'm tired," or
Wow.
I'm right?
Yeah. I'm like, this idiot.
Yes.
He's like earlier. Dad, okay. And it's exhausting. And I think sometimes, a lot of times our brains want to move on before our bodies are ready to. And so in moments like that, like I do think that there are ways to kind of numb ourselves sometimes. And I think numbing can be actually a tool at the moment. Like it's okay to step back from the healing. It's okay to not be in it 100% of the time, right? To allow yourself to find those pieces of joy and laughter. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I feel like I never advocate for numbing only because, like, I feel like that's how we resist, right? Like, because a feeling is it's just it's not good, bad, right, or wrong. It's just an intuitive message from our soul. So I feel like we numb because we feel like it's gonna be too painful to lean into
Mhm.
it, to, like, see what's there. And so I think a lot of us end up numbing as the initial coping mechanism.
Mhm.
But I agree with you that, like, if we actually, like, sometimes if we move into joy or we move into something else, maybe that gives us a little bit of courage or something to then kind of like or coming back to this place of what I would say alignment, because we want to get curious about this stuff, right? From a place of alignment. That's when we can, like, really see the truth of it. And so I know we all kind of, we zigzag around. It's like,
Mhm.
nah, I don't want to see that over there. So I'm going to go over here and, like, it's funny.
Yeah.
I'm like such a, like, dive deep, like, hate, like, but more on the suffering, probably unhealthy suffering side of the scale. And I'm always in awe of the people who, like, can distract with joy, because I'm like, that's like a much more fun path than the one that I, like, tend to go.
No, but I totally agree. And sometimes like I need to go to a comedy show or I need to turn on Netflix, right? And those can be like I'm like you. I'm like, let's walk into the fire
Yeah.
and deal with stuff. And sometimes it's like, yeah, like your soul gets tired and it's like, I need a breather here. Oh, I need to sit down for a second. And that's, I think, more of what I would say. Like sometimes I need to like take a step back. Like you don't need to be in it 1,000% of the time. Because sometimes it can be really feeling to soften too.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with. I actually think we probably need to find more of those moments to, like, it's a balance, right? I think that's it.
Yeah.
It's balance in all things. I tend to be a more serious person, and so I get really serious about the healing journey because I'm very motivated by healing. And when I go to that comedy show, or I'm like, "Oh, right, I needed this medicine." And we probably waited way too long to get to it, but yeah. So
Yeah, yeah. And then it goes to like what we were talking about with like holding the both hands, like
mm,
holding multiple things. It doesn't need to be like multiple realities also.
absolutely. Yeah. So as you think about, people maybe starting out on their spiritual journeys, what advice would you have for people?
It's a good question. I think, everyone's journeys are so unique and I don't think that there is a right answer and like a right next step. Just like focusing on the next step, right? And like I think for me, just like putting one foot down helps to inform where my other foot is gonna go. I don't need to see the entire picture. I don't need to understand the entire purpose of something, but it's like what's the next best action for myself? And just taking that and realizing there's no timeline, there's no race, there's no rush, and things unfold as they need to unfold and lessons come. But healing really is lifelong practice, the lifelong journey. And it's going to be one of those things where we're constantly showing up. There's going to be certain parts of life that are going to be coming back over and over and over again, right? There's certain things that you're just like, wait, I know them already. Here again? Are you kidding? but yeah, I think just being like open-minded and realizing again, there's no end.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a message I got from Spirit recently, and they were like, "You're not in a race, you're in a process." And I feel like that's exactly what you're saying. It's like this, there is no end to this. Like we heal in levels and layers. That's this again, really, right? Where we heal in spirals. And so I think that's really wise advice. And so one of the things that I just love to end on is, how do you feel like magic and miracles play out in your own life?
It's a good question. I think that magic it's led me to places that I honestly didn't even know were possible. And so just staying open to life and exercising curiosity helps me connect with magic in a lot bigger ways. And honestly, if you had told me 5 years ago that this is how my half decade would unfold, I would laugh at you. Like, that sounds horrible. Like, even looking back and be like, oh, it was really hard, but there was so much joy in it. And there was so much magic. And I met such amazing people. And I learned so much about myself. I know that's not an exact answer to your question, but just I think staying open, staying curious, and then being able to see all the flowers and the colors too. Like, it can be embracing all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I give you a lot of credit too, because I think it can be hard to move through some of the challenges that you've moved through specifically and still come out the other side being able to see, right, like what has blossomed as a result of it, as hard as it has been. And I do think that's a skill, like to be able to see that, the beauty in the pain. I think that's something that like not everybody just naturally gravitates to. Some people I think have to work harder to do that than others, but I think it's a beautiful thing when you're able to be in that place of like peace and acceptance where there was once pain.
Yeah, and I really do strongly believe that when we can find a purpose like beyond just ourselves and like creating a better world, I think that really helps ease that suffering.
Yeah, I think, it's a new level of purpose to the pain, right? And that can be a really beautiful thing. It's vulnerable to share, I think sometimes, right? That level and have to you said you were writing a memoir and I was writing my memoir as well. And so I know that crawling back into the you in that moment, right? When you lost your dad or the you going through the cancer diagnosis, like it's hard to crawl back into that person and relive some of those experiences. But to know other people might be able to like really find themselves in a piece of your story can also feel like really impactful.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like crawling back in then allows you to have a different perspective too, right? It's again peeling back those layers and you're approaching it, addressing it in a different way.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things for me, I don't know if you found a similar experience, it was like I actually learned how to have more empathy for my own journey in that process. Which was something that I had a hard time, finding before. It was kind of like you just wanted to like move through it, forget about it. I don't need to revisit that. But there's something about crawling back into it that's also like, no, we can honor, right? Like all of the pieces of ourselves that have been through what they've been through in order to create the human that we are today.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that so much. I really, really do.
So how can my listeners support you?
That's a great question. If they want to connect, we can connect on Instagram or, if like I also do one-on-one coaching as well as corporate wellness programming and keynote speaking. And so if there's anything in that realm that resonates with anyone, I would love to chat. And even if they have questions, they feel free to email me.
Awesome. So we will include all of your information in the show notes so people can find you easily. But thank you so much for being here today and sharing your story with us. I know everybody is going to take, whatever nugget they needed away from this conversation with them. So thanks, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you so much for listening to the Guided Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be so grateful if you would share it with a friend or even leave me a review so we can ensure that it makes its way into the ears of listeners who need to hear these messages most. Until next time, may you remember how guided you truly are.